Now, Australia, we haven't started our vaccination program yet. We're cautious, supplies aren't quite there, etc., etc. We're rightly cautious, and there's not a pressing need as there is in some of the European countries. Britain, though, has now vaccinated more than 11% of its population. Very impressive. And to get herd immunity, you really need to get more than 85% at least to get a jab, so they've got some way to go. In the United States, though, that could be a problem in some areas. Now, you've got new US President Joe Biden promising to step up the vaccine rollout to get 100 million vaccines out there in 100 days. But the thing is, not all states are using their supplies well and getting vaccines off the shelves and into people's arms. So what can we learn from this? Joining me for her weekly spot a short while ago was Sky News, well, our new US correspondent, Annelise Nielsen. Annelise Nielsen, thank you so much for joining me. The US has had 450,000 deaths so far. It really needs this vaccination program to work. How is it going so far?
It does, Andrew. Right now, the coronavirus situation in the US is really hitting its peak during the winter period. But one of the really interesting things to watch with the coronavirus vaccine implementation is how this could impact how it's done in Australia with the lessons you can learn from the rollout, because it's different in each state. And that's been really key in this rollout. Over 100 million vaccinations promised by Joe Biden in his first 100 days. Now, there's been over 49 million implemented so far, but you have to remember the current vaccines are 2 doses. And so you're not inoculated until you've had both. There's still a long way to go, even though they are on track to do that. And where we're going to start seeing this being implemented in stages after that is going to be fascinating as well, because states are taking very different tacks. Washington, D.C., for example, is looking at prioritising the obese and smokers above other groups because they say they're higher risk if they get coronavirus. Other states are looking at whether they should roll it out in inmate populations because they're higher risk being in more condensed environments and potentially spreading it to staff as well. So this is where we're going to start to see it get more controversial. Even Guantanamo Bay inmates were supposed to get the vaccine and they've rolled that back now. And this is where we're going to start to see Australians watching closely to see if it will affect how politicians think they should be implementing it back home. Absolutely.
Now, there have been complaints we've heard that, yes, the vaccines are being sent to the states, each different state, but not all of those states are getting enough of those vaccines into people's arms. Can you actually compare the different approaches from different states as to what might work in getting this enough people to take it, because you need that herd immunity, and what isn't working?
This has been one of the really interesting things right now. With the limited rollout, there isn't much opposition. People are desperate to get the vaccine, and they're the ones who are lining up at centres right around the country. But when we look at the ways that different states have implemented it, some have had much greater success than others. And 2 of the really interesting ones to watch in here have been Maryland as well as West Virginia. Now, Maryland's an interesting one because it has very high average income, high education in the population, normally the kind of people that would be extremely responsive to these public health programs. But you can see there, just 7.3% of the population's had at least one of those shots, and only 1.4% has had both. That's of a total of 884,000 shots and 60% of dosages used. Now, that's been the real challenge for so many of these centres that have been handing out the vaccinations, is making sure they have enough people at the right time. They've seen extremely high levels of people cancelling appointments, not showing up. Some have contracted COVID-19 in the meantime, and so they can't get the vaccination in that time. Other ones are simply not heard of anymore, and so it's frustrating, those approaches. Also, Maryland, though, they've had some learnings in that, sorry, I shouldn't use learnings, it's an awful word. They've had some lessons to be learned that they left it up to the counties to distribute it, and that decentralised approach really saw them losing a lot of vaccines in places that should have had the vaccines in people's arms. But they've also relied on corporate partnerships, having them roll out through pharmacies like CVS here that haven't had the local approach, haven't known the right people to call and say, we've got a vaccine, do you want to come down and grab it while you can? One of the states that I mentioned there, interesting to watch, West Virginia. Now, also because Maryland's a very blue state, West Virginia's very red, so I think this does show that this isn't necessarily a politicised issue in the United States. They've had 10.8% of the population having at least one shot, 3.8% have had 2 shots, 305,200 doses distributed, and 85% of those doses used. Now, they're one of the great success stories in the United States, even though they do have relatively low income, relatively poor access to healthcare in the United States. States. They're not known for being pro-vaccination generally, but this has been a real success story, the rollout there. And one of the successes they've had is using local pharmacies who have those local contacts to get the dosages out to the right people, and a very strongly centralised approach. So this has been one of the things that they've really learned in this process. As they roll it out to the wider population, these challenges are only going to get harder.
Well, that's interesting. Goes against the narrative that the Republicans are the ones that are sitting on their hands. Speaking of Republicans and Democrats, Joe Biden has only been a couple of weeks in the job as president. What's the difference been that people can notice between how he's starting off and how Donald Trump ended?
Well, the really big thing in the first few weeks of Joe Biden's presidency has been the use of executive orders. This is something that he's criticised in the past, but now has become a key tenet of him rolling out his administration's policies. Now, the Democrats' argument is, look, we're undoing a lot of the work that Donald Trump did by executive order, but they're also relying on this idea that this is an emergency, this is wartime response, and so they need to have a special set of powers for the executive to take charge and put order into chaos. But this is a country founded on democracy and the rule of the people. That happens through Congress. If they don't start spending enough time negotiating through Congress, there's going to start to be more criticism of the Joe Biden administration. Even today, this negotiation with these 10 Republican members about what they should be doing with the stimulus package, arguing that it should be much smaller than the $1.6 trillion that Joe Biden wants to do. That's already showing that he is coming back to the negotiating table more, looking to get more bipartisan support through Congress.
Seems like a man in a hurry, a man who doesn't think he'll serve a second term with his age and wanting to get his legacy off quick smart settled.